Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm Mandy Pellegrin. I am the Deputy Director at the Sycamore Institute. For those of you that don't know us, although we did testify here last year towards the end of session, we're a nonpartisan research center specifically for Tennessee, and we like to equip leaders like yourselves with data-driven resources to identify, understand, and solve big challenges. The thing that makes us unique is that we try to keep all of our analysis impartial. So you won't find us lobbying or advocating for any specific outcome, and our staff and board do come from across the political spectrum. So we're a resource for everyone, no matter where you stand on any particular issue. So the reason I'm here is about the budget. So crafting Tennessee's annual budget certainly qualifies as a big challenge. And one resource Sycamore has created to help you tackle that challenge is actually our state budget primer. This is what it looks like. I think we delivered one to each of your offices last week. This is our third edition of it, and new and improved. And there's more information about that on our website as well for folks who are interested in learning more about the budget process. And we even explain the differences in balances in the annual comprehensive financial report. And I'm probably a super user of that report. But this morning, I'm going to focus specifically on some information that will provide context for this upcoming budget cycle that you'll be working on over the next few months. To be clear, I am not an economist. I'm not an accountant. I can't tell you what's going to happen this year with inflation or unemployment or consumer spending. I view my job as sort of translating what those experts have to say on those topics to help you prepare for the budgeting decisions that you make, and hopefully to also help your constituents better understand what is going on here. Okay, so let's get started. So first things first, a quick reminder of your starting point for the 2024 process. At the end of the last legislative session, you all approved a roughly $53 billion state budget. The largest piece there, about half, comes from the state's own revenues, about $26.6 billion. And this is made up mostly of current year tax collections along with prior year balances. So question is, what is this state piece going to look like for this upcoming budget cycle? And for that, we have to look at projections of our tax collections. So we are looking at recurring state tax collections collected by the Department of Revenue. So coming out of the last budget, it was projected that Tennessee would collect about $19.2 billion in 2022, that's last fiscal year, and $19.6 billion in 2023, this current fiscal year. In actuality, Tennessee collected $20.8 in 2022, so that creates surplus that can be used during this budget process. And all of these projections are based on a recommended range from the State Funding Board, and that board met at the end of last year to revisit the current fiscal year, 2023, and project into next fiscal year, 2024. So in the current year, instead of that $19.6 billion, the funding board now thinks Tennessee will collect more like $22.2 to $22.3, and then there will be some very modest growth into 2024 at $22.5 to $22.8 billion. So what does all of that mean for the budget?
Ms. Pellegrin, let me stop right there and see if any questions on this, members? Just so you can digest it just for a moment, particularly the new members who are trying to absorb some of this. Okay, thank you. Oh, is there a question? No. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So what this means is that 2022 overcollection leaves about $1.6 billion in non-recurring surplus, and the funding board now thinks we'll collect at least $2.6 billion more than they had previously projected for the current fiscal year. So these mid-year revised collections are traditionally treated as non-recurring dollars for one-time expenses in the current year, or they're carried over as surplus and also treated as non-recurring.
Ms. Pellegrin, again, I hate to interrupt you, but just can you, just for the committee and for the public's consumption, can you define what recurring is versus non-recurring? And finance members, you will be asked this question 1,000 times by our colleagues up and down the hall. So if you please just help the public understand what that means.
In many ways, it is what it sounds like it is. Non-recurring means you expect it to only happen one time. Recurring is you expect it to happen year after year. It's a tool to help with long-term budget planning so that you don't sign yourself up for recurring expenses that you know are going to happen year after year without having revenues that you know are going to have to happen year after year. And then compared to that lower 2023 budget amount into 2024, the funding board expects another 2.9 to 3 billion into fiscal year 2024. So that is your recurring base. So that's kind of what you're working with for the 2024 budget. The governor's budget will be based on these projections. It will pick, the administration will pick a number within that range. Typically, it comes at the top of the range, and that's what the budget is based on those projections. Okay, so now just sort of zeroing in on only the general fund. The numbers are very similar here, but just a little bit lower because some of those projections are associated with other funds as well. Okay, so according to the state's most recent financial report, which you all just heard about, the ACFR, this 1.5 billion end-of-year surplus in 2022 from over-collections was really more like 2.4 billion when you include other revenues that are available and underspending. So they mentioned, for example, the vacancies within corrections, that number would be included in there. This also represents that unassigned balance that they talked about, but it backs out the rainy day fund. So this is what that kind of surplus looks like in a historical context. So these end-of-year surpluses are going back all the way to 2000. I have adjusted these numbers here for inflation. So 2 years in a row of very large, historically large surpluses. So that is a lot of one-time money available in this next budget process. And again, these numbers have already been adjusted for inflation, but inflation is hovering around 40-year highs, which is something important to keep in mind. So here we're looking at annual inflation in every month from 1966 through December of 2022. So last month we had annual inflation at about 6.4% nationally, down from a peak of 9% in June, but still we have not seen price increases this steep since about 1982. So what this means is that those state tax dollars won't go as far as they seem like they might at first blush. And to illustrate these effects, we're now going to look at the annual change in state tax collections all the way back to 1970. So again, this is the year-over-year percentage change in tax collections. So if it is above the line, that means revenues were growing from one year to the next. And if they're below the line, revenues were actually falling from one year to the next, which you see has been a relatively rare occurrence to actually see revenues fall from one year to the next. So, for example, state tax collections in 2021 were about 22% higher than the previous year, and they were another 14% higher in 2022. So that gives us some context for those very large surpluses that you saw on the previous slide.
Ms. Pellegrin, can you tell how do you calculate for in these graphs? How do you calculate for the impact of inflation or the effect that inflation has?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. Just hang on a minute.
Okay.
So for context, because I'm going to talk about this before I get to that, I'm going to talk about this other topic in a minute. All of these little pink areas are recessions. And no surprise, you see drops from the prior years, either slower growth from the previous year or revenues actually shrinking, particularly there during and after the Great Recession beginning in fiscal year 2008, which is the second to last box. So after you adjust these collections for inflation, here's what those annual rates looked like. So sometimes inflation outpaced revenue growth. In fact, there are 10 times during this particular window when revenues were growing in nominal, so unadjusted terms, so the dots were above the line, but in real inflation-adjusted terms, they were actually shrinking. So in other words, Those dollars didn't go as far as the amounts that were collected the year before. So this is actually a good segue for our next topic, because there's really nowhere where inflation is impacting state government more than the state's highway fund, which is expected to be a big topic this session. So we primarily fund road construction and maintenance in Tennessee with gas and fuel taxes. Both of these are excise taxes, so that means they are a fixed amount. So the gas tax is 26 cents per gallon. So no matter how much a gallon of gas costs, the state always collects 26 cents for each gallon sold. So this means that the only factors that grow the highway fund from these revenue sources is the rate itself, that 26 cents, or the number of gallons sold. And here is how that has translated to Tennessee's fuel tax collections. So looking back all the way to 1988, during that time, the state's gas tax was increased in 1989, and then the 2017 Improve Act gradually increased it over 3 years in fiscal years 2018, 2019, and 2020. And here's what collections looked like during that time, and now after adjusting for inflation. So collections tend to go up after the rate gets increased, and then inflation will steadily chip away at their value. And you see that happening faster in recent years here. These numbers were adjusted using the Consumer Price Index, which is sort of the standard consumer inflationary measure. We also looked at state highway revenues compared to other measures of growth or need. Now we're only looking at the window of 2005 to 2021, so not quite as far back as the previous slide. But first, we adjusted these dollars using the National Highway Construction Cost Index. So that is an inflationary measure just for the cost of building roads. And again, the lines here show you when those Improve Act increases went into effect. Next, per capita, so adjusting for population growth. Per 10,000 miles, vehicle miles traveled, so adjusting for growth in traffic. Per 100 miles of road, so adjusting for how much road we have in Tennessee. As a percent of statewide transportation needs, so this takes that money that we have, adjusted for inflation, and it compares it to the totals from TASER's annual inventory of infrastructure needs, for transportation, and these are just the projects in the construction and planning and design stages. And finally, as a percent of general fund tax collections. So how are these tax collections growing compared to other taxes? So you get the point, right? No matter how you measure it, the value of these taxes generally decline over time until they get increased, and then they get a temporary bump before beginning to decline in value again. And these trends are getting worse because of improved fuel efficiency of vehicles and a move to electric vehicles. Yesterday, we actually published a quick report that includes these calculations along with some other facts about how transportation gets funded in Tennessee.
Chairman Yeager.
I understand the erosion of the value of the money because of inflation, but you're telling us that when we do adjust the rate, there's a temporary bump. But would you explain that phenomena to me? Because it seems to me the inflation would still consistently erode.
Well, when you increase the rate, you get a temporary bump from whatever trajectory you were on. You don't necessarily get above where you started the last time you got your rate, which you can kind of see if you follow from, like on the very first, their adjusted road cost increases. You see, from $922 million back in 2005, almost got back up to that there within those initial Improve Act increases. But, well, on that one, it's not a great example, but it does start to go back down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think the point may be that if you raise it, $1, then for a couple of years, that dollar is more than what inflation is, and then inflation eventually catches up to that dollar, and then it becomes $1.05, $1.10, $1.15, and so that dollar that you initially had ahead of the game, you now start falling behind as inflation starts to chip away at it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I'm not an economist either, just so everyone knows. So. And I can only do simple math, which is, no, I'm sorry. Other questions?
Okay.
Don't be knocking on the Baylor now. I get personal about that. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just a couple more slides. So another potential impact of inflation and really the monetary policies that the federal government sets in response to inflation is the threat of a recession. So as we know, when a recession hits, you and the governor don't get a pass on the balanced budget requirement that's in our state constitution. So one tool that you all have to help you meet this goal are the dollars in the rainy day fund and in the 10-care reserve. So looking back to 2006, just before the Great Recession hit in 2007, here's what those reserves looked like. So the reserve for revenue fluctuation is on the bottom. That's called, this is really our rainy day fund in Tennessee. And then the 10-care reserve is on top there. So just before the Great Recession, Tennessee had amassed about $1.1 billion, spent that down to about $422 million, and then to get through the recession and its very long after effects. And then since then, you all have been replenishing those funds. At the end of fiscal year 2023, the total is set to reach $3.1 billion in both of those accounts combined. Again, these are nominal dollars, so they are not adjusted for inflation in any way. They don't tell us about the spending power of those dollars, which in this context is really driven by the size of the state budget. So this line represents the number of days of general fund operations that these dollars alone would cover. So if every dollar went away and you could only live off the rainy day fund, how long would it get you? So it was about 42 days going into the Great Recession, got down to about 14 in those years after, and by the end of 2021, it represented about 62 days of the general fund's actual expenditures. So better off than going into the Great Recession. Now, just zooming out for a moment from just the state budget, I'm going to end with just a very high-level overview of some of the economic forces that will shape our economy, both in the short and the long term, and ultimately the budget as well. So some of these create uncertainty, and others give us reason for optimism. At the same time, some of these trends are national, some are even international, and some are specific to Tennessee. So again, creating uncertainty, we have high inflation and the federal monetary policies that bring that into check, which is increased interest rates. I think we may be expecting another increase tomorrow. Related and interrelated to those things are continued supply chain pressures and international conflicts, all of which could push us into a recession. In Tennessee, we have higher home prices that have pushed a lot of people out of certain markets across the state. Yet, the market seems to be cooling because of the effects of those higher interest rates. Due to inflation and a tight labor market, we're seeing wages go up, which can push costs up for the producers, but it also pushed prices up for consumers, so those wages don't go as far. Meanwhile, workforce participation still has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, so we're not really operating at full capacity right now. We continue to face an aging population with a number of cascading effects on the economy, the state budget, state revenues, and we've seen our college-going rates decline, both in Tennessee and nationally as a result of the pandemic. So the number of high school grads going on to post-secondary has dropped, and this could have long-lasting effects both on our economy and nationally. But there are some cause for optimism. So Tennessee's economy, or GDP, has grown at a stronger pace than most of the rest of the country, I think better than all but one state in the first 3 quarters of 2022. We continue to see strong population growth, and our job market has grown to meet that demand, so we continue to have very low unemployment, and we have job openings that leave the potential for even more economic growth. So with that, I will finish and entertain any questions.
Great, thank you very much. Questions? Chairman Hensley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on that college going rates, is that considering students going to vocational schools as well?
My understanding is that the way that is measured, it includes any post-secondary after you graduate from high school, so it would include,
Vocational
that.
schools as well? And that's nationwide, that's not for Tennessee?
That's right.
Okay. And one other question about the rainy day fund. I thought we had 1.8 billion in the rainy day fund, and it says 3.1 billion. That's considering 10 care reserves too?
Yeah.
And that's, if we don't add any more money to it, we'll have 3.1 billion at the end of the year.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Chairman Yeager.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the declining college enrollment, can you offer any analysis of why this is happening?
I am not in a position to speak on that, but I'm sure THEC has. I think they put out a report specifically
They
on
do.
this recently.
I just kind of want to hear what you had to say.
Yeah,
about
I'm
it.
sorry.
No, that's quite all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll offer one, Chairman. It's a value proposition
All right.
that people are beginning to question whether the cost of higher education is worth the value that they get out of it. Mr. Wally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Pellegrin, for the presentation. Wondered if you might comment a bit on the statewide transportation needs, the TASER report that you referenced. Does that include municipal and county infrastructure needs as well as our state highway needs?
That does, yes. So that's a comprehensive inventory where they go to TDOT and then they also go to local officials to, inventory all the needs. And just as a point of reference, locals rely on the same gas and fuel taxes that the state collects because the state shares those with local governments. The report that we actually posted last night showed that about 51% of local spending on transportation costs comes from the state. So they are also relying on the state's gas and fuel taxes.
And could you comment a bit on the trend over the last 5 years? Has it escalated dramatically, our road infrastructure needs? I mean, obviously, most of us that, particularly I think that live out in some of the more rural districts are regularly hearing about, the infrastructure needs of our state as well as federal, local, and, municipal roads.
I wouldn't want to comment on that without looking back at some information.
Okay.
Can't say for certain.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, Chairman Yeager.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The TASER had just recently approved its annual infrastructure report, and Mr. Chairman, any member, you or any member of that, we're happy to provide, and we'll provide that report to you if you'd like to see it. There's some very useful graphics in the report as well that illustrate just what this dialogue that's been going on here.
And they have a great dashboard where you can
Yes.
explore it by county even.
We're happy to provide whatever the Senator Wally or you, Mr. Chairman, would like.
Chairman Yeager is chairman of TASER.
Oh.
And I would just say that the one thing you have to be careful about that TASER report is that it's not necessarily divided into needs and wants and wishes. They're all thrown in there. And so
Yeah.
you can find a lot of projects in there that, if we had the money to do this, it would be something we do, but it's not necessarily a need that we have. And so I would just caution that those numbers are a little bit inflated because, and it's kind of dynamic, like some of them, when I've looked at it, some of them that were important last year are, they're not important anymore. So you have to be careful about that number, but it's a good frame of reference. Other questions? I'm sorry, Senator Yarbrough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation, Ms. Pellegrin. If you could, just from kind of a big picture standpoint, give us a sense of what we should be anticipating as in the week before the budget is released. What is sort of available in terms of non-recurring revenue and recurring revenue in terms of budget development this year?
Right. So kind of going back to those very first, these animations really make going back in time difficult. So this is kind of what you're looking at right here is 1.5 billion non-recurring, again, 2.4 billion non-recurring, which is what the ACFR reported as basically being unassigned, so it's not obligated for anything specific, and that is with the rainy day fund backed out. So you have that from last year. And then based on the funding board re-estimate of the current year, they're thinking we'll get another $2.5 billion above what the budget was based on for the current year. So those are sort of 2.4, plus 2.5, $5 billion.
$5 billion non-recurring?
Typically, those are treated as non-recurring, yeah.
And then what about on the recurring side?
That 2.9 billion there.
Okay, thank you. And you had a slide which sort of shows that the, most recent general fund surpluses of the most recent 2 years are, sort of high, uniquely so by Tennessee standards, for the last couple of decades. I'm curious if there's other states that have this sort of, that follow this sort of trend, or and just if you could help us understand why our general fund surpluses are as high as they are.
I mean, a couple different things are going on. One is, my understanding is that state revenues in general, nationally, have been much more volatile since the Great Recession. The sales tax tends to be the least volatile of all taxes, so ours should be least volatile, and especially ones that include a grocery tax, because kind of regardless of how the economy's doing, you need groceries. So that's kind of going on nationally, which means it's just harder to predict what your revenues are going to be. Obviously, we have always been a very conservative state when it comes to budgeting. I guess you'd rather face a surplus than a budget deficit in the middle of the year and have to make those hard decisions. And so it does seem that these surpluses are bigger, and I can't explain if there is, what the intent, if there is any specific intent behind the way that projections have been made or adopted by the funding board and in the budget. Obviously, these last 2 years are sort of special animals because of the COVID pandemic, very cautious going into that, keeping spending low, and then, we had really great revenue growth just because folks had a lot of money to spend and were spending it. Some folks had a lot of money to spend and were spending it. And then we also had some changes to the way that online sales tax worked that happened to go into effect at about the same time. So it was sort of two things at one time, and just did a lot better than folks expected us to do.
Others? I will say that the overcollections are truly a function of budgeting decisions, and controlling of spending. We always try to project out that we're going to have overcollections because, as you pointed to, we would rather deal with overcollections than undercollections, which result in budgetary cutting. So, and I've lived through a couple of those up here. So I think sometimes that's confusing to other members, is that how can we have all these overcollections? Well, if you control your spending by design, then most likely you're going to end with in the black or with an over collection. Other questions? I have a couple of more. See if any other members. On the transportation side, and this might be an economist question, so it might be something for you to ponder, but I would assume the largest consumer of road construction is the government. Would that?
I would assume so.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so does the government, by its nature of building roads on the demand side, actually contribute to the inflationary cost of transportation products? And if the government were to constrain itself from building projects, would the inherent supply and demand require the cost to come down?
I mean, intro to economics, I've taken maybe 4 economics classes, but I mean, yes, it's sort of classic, simple supply and demand. If the government is spending more money in a market on transportation, projects, there's only so much supply there to meet that demand, and so the prices are going to go up because you can sort of demand more money. So I would suspect that government does contribute government spending contributes to inflation in the sectors that it is spending in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to curious, and I realize transportation market is a global market, and, you know, other countries also are building and constructing at a high pace, but it would seem as we've used Recovery Act dollars on infrastructure projects, we've significantly increased demand, which has contributed to the increase in price of the products because we're using more of them. The other thing is, you mentioned when we were talking about some of our carryover revenues, I think one thing we have to be careful about there is some of those revenues contain unfilled positions. We heard them talk about it in the ACFR, and you mentioned it again today, is that some of those revenues are, it looks like money that would be available that a member might want to use for a certain project, but in reality, it's actually allocated out for other positions. And I think we call that payroll equity, right? You may not know that term, but I think that's what, you will hear that term, members, as budgets come down the pike to us. Payroll equity, which is where a department has 100 positions available to it. We fund 100 positions, but only 75 of them are filled. So they have 25 positions worth of money available. That's equity in those positions. They will frequently, I think actually transportation may bring a proposal around that, how they use that payroll equity. So just for the new members, that's a term you're going to hear a lot usually when we talk about new positions with various entities. Any further questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. I hope other members that aren't on this committee, this will be available, of course, on the legislative website, and I hope members will take a chance to look at it. At least it's a good primer.